So, in the last video, I kind of said that we would go and do one more week on the Cobra before switching back to here. But I realised I needed to realistically order more things to be able to get a decent weekend's work on the project. So I'll get all that ordered and see how I feel when it arrives. So what that means, loyal viewer, is that we're back on the main project. And in line with my new policy of only putting something out when I've done a decent amount, this week we're going to get something done that's been annoying me for about 10 years. We're going to make the rear window frame for the roof. Now, I'm sure a few of you in the past would have quite reasonably assumed that the large rectangular opening in the back of the roof was indeed the rear window. But not so fast there, my friend. I've decided to go for something a lot more in keeping with the style of the car, and we're doing an oval-shaped window frame. The first thing to do is break out the cardboard and make a template that fits the aperture. The thing to think about here is not to make the curvature too tight. We're going to be stretching an L-shaped piece of metal, and if you make it too tight, the metal can split. Fortunately, this looks just about right. So, having bent some 1mm mild steel into a 90-degree angle, it was over to the stretcher to start putting in a curve. These stretchers and shrinkers are vital for forming metal, and they basically work by having a pair of jaws that when you press the foot pedal, either stretches or shrinks the metal by pulling it apart or pressing it together. By doing that on an L-shaped piece, it will force a curve into it. The stretching part can technically be done with just a hammer, but it produces very inconsistent curves and tends to damage the surface of the metal more. This way is nice and controllable and gives a very smooth curve. The trick here is to regularly keep referring to the template and not just do it by eye. It's just so tempting to glance at it and think, yeah, that looks good. But when you compare it with the template, and you then discover it's time for Henry Cavill to say his thing. Okay, shape made, it's back to the car to test fit it, and it looks good. On to making the other side. Now, before I started welding everything on, I realised that the lower part of the roof had somehow slightly warped, so that needed straightening. The good news is I have a large hammer and some frustration that needed working off. So, after a brief metal hammer interface situation, all was good. It was time to weld. Having got everything straight, I was very conscious that I didn't want to just warp it all again. So it was a case of a series of small tacks all the way around, giving the metal plenty of time to cool down. The good news for me here was that the actual frame I'm welding to is pretty strong 20mm box section, so it isn't likely to warp. But as I found out with straightening the lower bar, if it does bend, it takes a lot of effort to get it back again. After standing back and admiring the overall shape a bit, and this is an important part of building anything, I could then turn my attention to creating the filling sections for each corner. These are just small fillets of 1mm steel sheet, cut and shaped to fit. The only problem with welding these is where they taper to a fine point at the end, they get progressively harder to weld without just blowing through the metal. However, with some very careful light welding tacks, I got them in place. Then it was time for the mind-numbingly boring part of welding all the way around. This is one of those tasks that you start and you think it's just never going to end because there is just so much gap and so little weld. But you stick at it, keep going and keep welding, stopping from time to time to let everything cool down. And then you suddenly reach a point where you have more weld than gap, and you fly through the last bits. That, however, is just, unfortunately, the halfway point on the tedious scale. You then have to grind it all down, which is the same sort of frustration. You start grinding, and you start thinking, this is never gonna end. And then suddenly, you start to see flat sections appear, and then you have less lumps and bumps to grind through. Finally, you finish the last bits, and you can stand back and admire your work. And in this case, I could take a lot of pleasure in thinking that I think this is largely the last major piece of seam welding to do on the whole car. So, next time we will be finishing up the roof. It needs a few more small bits to be able to get it done, and really just some fine tuning to make it align to the windscreen properly. But with that done, we can fold it away under the rear cover and think about moving on to something else. I'm not sure what that's going to be yet, but it's good to be making progress again on this car. And there is definitely less tasks in front of us now than behind. I'll see you next time.